You feel that sharp, icy needle of anxiety stabbing right between your shoulder blades every time the clock strikes 8 and the house goes silent. This isn't a new burden. It has been gnawing at your spirit for months, slowly turning your own home into a stranger's cage. You've tried staying busy in the garden, keeping your head down, and convincing yourself that your daughter's coldness is just a phase, but nothing stops the trembling in your hands. This suffocating tightness in your throat isn't a sign of age, but a warning that the people you trust most are currently drafting your disappearance. In the next few minutes, you will understand exactly what is happening behind your back. My name is Elias Vance Thorne, and at 67, I am a retired senior urban architect living a life of calculated, humble silence. To the neighbors, I am just an old man in a dusty jacket, but I am the ghost who designed the very metropolitan grid they walk upon. My world was once defined by steel, but now it is anchored by the memory of my late wife, Martha. She was a kindergarten teacher who smelled of lavender and fresh cedar, and 12 years ago, her heart stopped while I was busy building skyscrapers. I missed the early signs of her illness due to my own blind ambition. Now, I stay in our small bungalow as penance, finally choosing simple shadows over my own architectural vanity. My daily rhythm is a clockwork of solitude, starting at 5 in the morning to tend a community garden I secretly funded. I drink black coffee from a chipped World's Best Dad mug, a relic of the days when my daughter Isabella still looked at me with pride. Now 26 and a social climbing strategist, she views my humble habits as a stain, unlike my son Julian, a carpenter who values honest labor. Before we proceed, I want to thank you for being here. Please comment below and tell me where you are watching from today. Also, please note that while this story is a dramatization inspired by real social dynamics, the lessons on family and integrity remain very real. As I stood in the dim light of the coat room, my eyes drifted to a bronze commemorative plaque near the service entrance, dated November 12, 1994. It listed the primary endowment for the glass pavilion under a name that made my heart skip: the Martha Grace Foundation. I felt a cold chill settle in my marrow because that foundation shouldn't exist in any public record. I had created it as a private tribute to my late wife. Why was it displayed here, in a building my daughter claimed was owned by the city's elite? I tried to tell myself it was a clerical error, yet the specific date of our wedding anniversary was etched clearly in polished metal. Before I could process the plaque, a frantic assistant dropped a stack of banquet orders labeled Thorne Family Private Reserved. I picked one up, noticing the signature at the bottom wasn't Isabella's script, but the familiar heavy ink of my old foreman, Marcus. The document authorized a $250,000 credit line for tonight's catering, yet Isabella spent the morning complaining she had to sell her car to afford the venue's deposit. The math didn't work. The girl who treated me like a janitor was using my ghost assets without knowing their origin. A heavy suspicion began to bloom in my chest, a dark realization that my silence had built a cage I no longer understood. I stayed in the coat room shadows, but my mind was already drafting a map of the deceit. Using a master override code I'd memorized back in 1994, I accessed the service terminal hidden behind a mahogany panel. The screen flickered to life, displaying the building's internal financial routing. My breath hitched as I saw a transfer of $1.2 million dated March 12, 2026, labeled as a maintenance fee to a company called Vanguard Urban Holdings. This pavilion was designed to be a public gift, its upkeep covered by a municipal trust I'd established decades ago. Why was a private entity suddenly siphoning funds from a ghost account I thought was dormant? My fingers moved with the muscle memory of an architect who knew every conduit and wire in this $100 million structure. I pulled up the primary endowment files, and my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. The Martha Grace Foundation, which I'd founded with $5 million of my own life savings, was now listed as the lead equity partner for the Sterling Banking Group. Someone had taken my wife's name, a name that represented purity and sacrifice, and dragged it into the murky waters of corporate debt. My daughter's face flashed in my mind, her dismissive sneer now looking more like a mask of deep-seated guilt. The first concrete anomaly appeared in the digital signature field of the last 3 quarterly reports. The authorizations weren't signed by a city official or a legal trustee, but by a senior project consultant, using the initials IT, Isabella Thorne. My daughter, the girl who claimed she couldn't afford a car, was signing off on multi-million-dollar capital expenditures. I checked the IP address of the last login, and it matched the Sterling estate on 455 Oakwood Lane. This wasn't just a social climb. It was a systematic hijacking of my architectural legacy. The foundations of my quiet life were cracking, revealing a cavernous lie that threatened to swallow us both. From the corner of my eye, I saw a familiar figure enter the main atrium, flanked by security. It was Mayor Anthony Russo, a man I'd mentored for 10 years when he was just an ambitious intern named Tony. He looked older, his hair a distinguished silver, but he still carried the same heavy, purposeful stride I'd taught him. He was the only man alive who knew the true weight of the Vanguard compass in my pocket. If Isabella was trying to play in the big leagues using my name, Anthony was the only one who could verify the truth. I needed to reach him without alerting the Sterlings. A heavy hand landed on my shoulder, and I braced for an eviction. Instead, I turned to see Marcus, my old foreman from the 1994 project, now wearing a security blazer that looked 2 sizes too small. His eyes widened behind thick glasses, and he whispered, "Elias, is that really the boss in a coat room?" I gripped his forearm, feeling the familiar strength of a man who'd poured concrete alongside me for decades. He told me he'd been hired specifically by the Sterlings to ensure no unauthorized Thorne relatives made it past the velvet ropes. The irony was a bitter pill. My own workers were being used to exile me. Marcus leaned in closer, his voice trembling with a mix of respect and fear. He revealed the first layer of the conspiracy. Isabella had presented a forged death certificate for me to the Sterling family lawyers last June. She'd claimed I'd passed away in a tragic accident, leaving her as the sole grieving heir to the Thorne architectural dynasty. By doing so, she'd secured a $15 million dowry and a partnership that would merge the Sterling's banking power with my citywide land patents. My own daughter had buried me alive for a seat at their table, trading my pulse for a title she didn't earn. The second revelation was even more devastating than the first. Marcus handed me a crumpled banquet itinerary he'd intercepted from the catering office. The Martha Grace Foundation wasn't just a name on a plaque. It was the primary vehicle being used to launder offshore investments for Julian Sterling's speculative real estate ventures. They were using my wife's memory to hide dirty money from the federal regulators. My hands shook as I realized that the very building I'd designed to be a sanctuary of light was being used as a dark room for financial crimes. This wasn't just about my pride anymore. It was about protecting Martha's honor. I realized then that my self-imposed penance of silence had become the perfect cover for their greed. By living in the shadows of my bungalow, I'd given Isabella the space to rewrite our history. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. They had siphoned the royalties from my urban patents, totaling nearly $4.2 million annually, into accounts I no longer controlled. Every skyscraper in the skyline, every bridge crossing the river, was now paying a Thorne tax that went straight into the Sterling's pockets. The web of deceit was woven into the very fabric of the city, and I was the spider who'd been cast out of his own web. I watched Isabella laughing with Julian Sterling across the hall, her silk dress shimmering under the lights I'd engineered. She looked like an angel, but she was a vulture picking at the bones of a legacy she hadn't lifted a single brick to build. I felt a cold, sharp clarity replace my grief. I wasn't just an embarrassing father anymore. I was a living liability for the biggest fraud in the city's history. I turned to Marcus and told him to get word to Anthony Russo immediately. Before we reached the point of no return, I want to ask you something. Type reveal in the comments if you want to see Isabella's reaction. I sat in the server room at 8:14 p.m., the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my cracked glasses. The Vanguard Urban Holdings ledger wasn't just a corporate shell. It was a digital graveyard for my life's work. I traced a wire transfer of $1,145 made on February 14, 2026, directly into the Sterling Private Equities vault. This wasn't just about Julian Sterling's greed. It was a surgical extraction of the Thorne legacy. Every cent intended for city maintenance was being diverted to fund the Sterling's failing luxury developments in the South District. My daughter's digital footprint was all over the authorization logs, her login ID, isthorne99, appearing alongside every fraudulent transaction that drained my wife's memorial fund. The deeper I dug into the encrypted subfolders, the more the Thorne tax revealed its suffocating reach. For over 5 years, the royalties from my 1994 urban grid patents, which generated precisely $415,800 annually, had been funneled into 12 offshore shell companies. Names like Martha's Hope Lightide and Graceful Pillars were used to mask the theft, turning my wife's beautiful name into a shield for criminal activity. It wasn't just money. They were siphoning the soul out of my architectural contributions to this city. I realized that if these records went public without the proper context, I wouldn't just be a victim. I would look like the mastermind behind a multi-decade embezzlement scheme. My investigation hit a wall when I discovered a folder titled Project Zero Erasure. Inside were scanned documents from the city clerk's office, including a property deed for my own bungalow at 112 Willow Street. The title had been transferred to a company called Evergreen Liquidation 3 months ago for a measly sum of $10. My daughter had sold my home, the last place I felt Martha's presence, out from under me while I slept in my armchair. But she hadn't done it alone. The notary on the document was Commissioner Silas Halloway, a man I'd once called a friend. The conspiracy had roots in the very government I helped build from the dirt. Suddenly, the server room's cooling fan slowed to a rhythmic, ominous hum, and the security monitor in the corner pivoted toward me with a mechanical click. I wasn't just watching them. They were watching me. I realized that my master override code, the one I thought was my secret weapon, had likely triggered a silent alarm in the Sterling Estate Security Hub. A cold sweat broke across my brow as I realized the risk had shifted from financial to physical. I was a 67-year-old man trapped in a high-tech fortress designed by my own hand, now being used as a cage. The shadows of the pavilion felt like they were closing in for the kill. I heard the heavy thud of tactical boots echoing in the corridor outside the server room. The Sterlings didn't just have security. They had a private enforcement team led by a man named Victor Vane, a disgraced ex-detective known for making problems disappear. I shoved the Vanguard compass deep into my pocket, its sharp edges biting into my palm as a reminder of my foundational reality. If they caught me here, I wouldn't be handled with the embarrassment Isabella showed in the lobby. I would be processed as a trespasser and a corporate spy. The very walls I engineered to protect the public were now being weaponized to bury my last remaining shred of sanity. I scrambled to download the most damning piece of evidence, Death Certificate 0045B, issued by the State Medical Board on June 12, 2025. It listed Elias Vance Thorne as deceased due to a pulmonary embolism, signed by a Dr. Eris Thorne, a name that didn't exist in any medical registry. This was the document Isabella used to claim my $15 million dowry from the Sterling family. Legally, I was a ghost. I didn't exist in the eyes of the law, which meant if something happened to me tonight in this dark server room, there would be no investigation and no justice. I was a living man being erased by his own daughter's signature. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I opened the final file. The Martha Grace Foundation offshore logs. It showed that $50 million in charity donations from the city's elite had been laundered through a fake hospital project in the Bahamas. This wasn't just a social climb. Isabella and Julian Sterling were running a high-stakes laundering operation that could bring down the entire metropolitan government. They had used my wife's name to buy silence from the very people who should have protected the city. The scale of the corruption was so vast that it made my architectural legacy look like a child's Lego, set in a hurricane of greed. A notification popped up on the terminal, intercepted from Isabella's private server. It was an email to Julian Sterling sent at 7:15 p.m. tonight. "The old man is becoming a liability," it read. "He's asking too many questions about the foundation. We need to move him to the long-term facility in the morning before the mayor starts sniffing around." The long-term facility was code for a private psychiatric ward owned by the Sterlings, a place where people were drugged into a permanent silent fog. My own daughter was planning to lobotomize my memories to save her silk-draped reputation. The betrayal was complete. She wasn't just ashamed of me. She wanted me dead inside. I grabbed the flash drive and sprinted toward the service elevator, but the doors opened to reveal 3 men in black suits, their faces cold and professional. One of them held a syringe, the sedative glistening in the sterile light. I had the truth in my hand, but I was seconds away from losing my mind and my freedom forever, in the very building that bore my wife's name. This is where things get incredibly disturbing, and I need to warn you before we proceed. What you're about to see next might change how you view your own family. If you're not ready for the ultimate betrayal, you should leave this video now. I stood paralyzed in the service elevator as the men in black suits closed in, but then the lead guard stopped, staring at the brass Vanguard compass I had pulled from my pocket. He didn't attack. Instead, he stepped back and whispered into his radio that the primary key had been located. I realized then that my daughter didn't just want to hide me. She was hunting for this specific tool to finalize the permanent transfer of my urban patents. The digital logs I'd just downloaded flashed a name on the screen that shouldn't be there: Martha Thorne, with a signature dated only 3 weeks ago. My heart stopped because my wife has been buried for 12 years. The air in the narrow corridor suddenly felt like lead, crushing my lungs until I had to lean against the cold steel wall for support. The lead guard handed me a tablet showing a live feed from a high-security villa in the North District, and my vision blurred as I saw a woman sitting in a garden, her hands tending to cedar and lavender. It was Martha. She wasn't dead. The sudden heart condition 12 years ago was a clinical abduction staged by the Sterling family with the help of a young, ambitious intern, the man who was now Mayor Anthony Russo. My legs gave out, the vibration of the building's foundations echoing the violent shaking in my own knees. Suddenly, every memory of the last decade shifted into a grotesque new shape. I remembered the night Martha died, how Anthony Russo was the one who insisted on a closed casket and a private cremation that he personally oversaw to spare me the grief. I also remembered Isabella's strange lack of tears at the funeral, her cold eyes focused only on the inheritance papers she was already holding at the age of 14. She wasn't a grieving child. She was a junior partner in a kidnapping that traded her mother's freedom for the Sterling social protection. The love I felt for my daughter curdled into a cold, sharp blade of absolute, unadulterated fury. I gripped the Vanguard compass until the metal bit into my palm, drawing a single drop of blood that stained the brass. They didn't just steal my legacy. They stole the sun from my sky and let me live in a basement of manufactured grief for 12 years. I am no longer the ghost architect seeking penance. I am the designer of their destruction, and I will tear this pavilion down brick by digital brick to get my wife back. Before I step out into that gala to face the monsters I helped create, I need to know you are still with me. Are you ready to see the end of the Thorne dynasty? Type "ready" right now. Elias walked into the center of the gala at 9:42 p.m., the Vanguard compass held firmly like a detonator. The Sterling elites paused, their champagne flutes frozen as the janitor they mocked occupied the silent epicenter of the room. I didn't hide in the coat room this time. I stood beneath the vaulted glass ceiling I had calculated to the millimeter in 1994. Beside me, Marcus stood with 4 city officers, their badges reflecting the cold, architectural lighting. Isabella rushed forward, her face a mask of calculated fury as she signaled security to remove me. She didn't realize that the man she was calling a trespasser was actually the registered deed holder of the very floor she walked upon. Mayor Anthony Russo stepped through the crowd, his heavy footsteps echoing against the Italian marble. He didn't look at the bankers or the debutantes. He walked straight to me and bowed his head with a reverence that silenced the entire hall. "Mr. Thorne, I am so sorry for the delay in processing the audit," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the pavilion. He turned to Isabella, his eyes turning into chips of gray ice. He pulled out the forged death certificate, dated June 12, 2025, and held it up for the Sterlings to see. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a multi-million-dollar fraud finally coming to light. Isabella let out a shrill, nervous laugh, clutching Julian Sterling's arm as if it were a life raft. "This is a ridiculous misunderstanding, Anthony. My father is mentally unwell. He's been suffering from delusions since my mother died," she stammered, her gaze darting toward the security exit. She tried to play the role of the concerned, grieving daughter, spinning a narrative of senility to protect her precarious social standing. She claimed the Vanguard compass was just an antique toy and that I was being manipulated by political rivals. Her manipulation was desperate and transparent, a thin veneer of silk trying to cover a foundation of rot that was collapsing under the mayor's uncompromising judicial gaze. When I showed her the live feed of the villa, Isabella's composure shattered like tempered glass. "You were always too busy, building your precious city while we starved for your pride," she screamed, her voice echoing with 12 years of resentment. She confessed to orchestrating the abduction, admitting she preferred a dead father and a hidden mother to the reality of our humble bungalow. She boasted about the $50 million they laundered through the foundation, her eyes burning with unrepentant greed. The Sterlings backed away as if she were a plague, leaving her alone in the epicenter of the hall she tried so hard to conquer for her own hollow legacy. The heavy click of handcuffs ended the Thorne dynasty as officers secured Isabella and Julian Sterling. Mayor Russo announced that the district attorney had already frozen $140 million in assets tied to Vanguard Urban Holdings and the Sterlings' fraudulent real estate ventures. Isabella faced 25 years for kidnapping and federal wire fraud, while Julian's family saw their banking licenses revoked for a century of corruption. The stolen royalties, totaling over $60 million, were immediately diverted back to the public infrastructure fund I had established decades ago. The justice was cold and surgical, stripping them of every luxury they had purchased with the blood and memories of my stolen 12-year grief. As the police led the conspirators out, the massive chandeliers I designed flickered and dimmed, as if the building itself was exhaling in relief. I stood alone in the wreckage of the Gala, the silk ribbons and expensive flowers looking like trash on the foundation I once bled for. Outside, a black car waited to take me to the North District Garden, where Martha was finally waiting for the man she thought was gone. A sudden rain began to strike the glass pavilion, the rhythmic tapping sounding exactly like the hammer I used to build our first home. I turned my back on the high society world, finally stepping toward the only truth that ever mattered. It has been exactly 8 months since the rain washed the Sterling name off the glass pavilion, and the North District Garden is finally in full bloom. Martha sits on the cedar bench I built, the scent of lavender clinging to her skin just as I remembered it. We don't talk much about the darkness, focusing instead on the Thorne Foundation for Urban Integrity, which now provides housing for 300 families. I still drive my old truck, but the world's best dad mug is finally replaced by the warmth of her hand in mine. The scar of Isabella's betrayal remains, but seeing Martha breathe the fresh air makes every brick of that painful night worth the price. You might look at your own life and feel like a ghost in your own home. But remember that the stone the builders rejected always becomes the cornerstone. I spent years building towers of steel while ignoring the lavender in my own garden, and that was my greatest architectural failure. Don't be like Isabella, chasing the fragile shine of glass while spitting on the ground that holds you up. True legacy isn't a name on a building. It's the character you show when the lights are off. Please comment, share, and subscribe to join our family. This story is a dramatization inspired by real social dynamics, but the lessons on family and integrity remain very real.